confidence in the government.
The Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in part one of the inquiries bill. I just want to begin by commending my colleague, the Honourable Annette King, for instigating this bill in 2008, some 5 and a bit years ago. And the driving force for that instigation was because of the frustration that many people felt, as has been explained by other contributors in this part of the debate, the frustration that many of us felt about the lack of ability of inquiries to really get to the basis of the truth. And that's a really important point for the Committee of the House to consider, because the reason that inquiries are called for, whether it's by the Governor-General at the instigation of the Governor-General or at the instigation of a minister, is because from the public's point of view, there is some information that we don't have, and the public of New Zealand quite rightfully expect that information to be made available to them. And these are about serious matters. We've had 2 very serious inquiries over recent times in New Zealand. The first one was in relation to the Pike River tragedy, and the Minister and the Chair is very familiar with the recommendations that flowed from that, and I certainly hope that the focus on health and safety, particularly in the mining area, continues. And what a massive tragedy that we had to suffer before that focus was given. But it's there now. But once again, we know that the families on the West Coast are frustrated about the lack of complete information that they have, and that's primarily because of the inability of the inquiry, because of its terms of reference, to get that information for them. In my own town of Christchurch, we have had similar situations with inquiries where in the Royal Commission on the collapse of Canterbury buildings, we have seen, with the example of the collapse of the CTV building, an extraordinary series of faults where people have acted irresponsibly, where people have acted beyond the scope of their registration and their ability, where people have cut corners and lied about things being safe or otherwise, and as a result of that series of errors, we lost 115 lives in one building. Mr Speaker, there cannot be more a greater call for the right for the public to know what happened in the first instance, and the right of people to be confident that Parliament will address the causes of tragedies such as the 2 that I have just outlined, and that the public of New Zealand, our citizens, can be sure that we knew the facts and we addressed them to make sure that such situations could never occur again. And that is not the current situation with inquiries. For a variety of reasons, there are often frustrations that either the person leading the inquiry or, in my view, more importantly, the members of the public who are waiting for that information, so critical for their ability to understand the situation and perhaps, if it's appropriate, to move on in their lives. So the ability of the terms of reference to be set in a way that satisfies that public interest is not in the current law. In 2008, Annette King recognised that. She got a very good report from the Law Commission, and this bill was a result of it. It was reported back into Parliament by what I understand was an excellent government administration committee. It was chaired at the time by David Parker. Our deputy leader, Grant Robertson, sat on that committee. He's contributed. He was a junior member of the committee at the time. That's how long ago it was, 2009. And here we are, some time later, 4.5 years later, actually 4 years, 9 months later, looking at this with some urgency. Now, Mr Chairman, I want to go on later in this debate to the reason for the urgency, but just to briefly allude to it before I move back to the other questions about the scope that are dealt with in the primary purpose of this legislation. The reason that the government has brought this inquiries back to the House suddenly with such huge pressure is for a very serious reason, and that is because of the Fonterra issues of contamination in our exports. Mr Chairman, I don't think there is a single person in this House who would consider, Mr Chairman,
Honourable Ruth Dice.
I don't believe there's a single member of this House who would not confirm that in relation to potential contamination of any of our export products, that the safety of consumers, particularly when those consumers are children, is not paramount. So I want to say to the government that despite their total inability to manage their legislative program, which has left us looking at this bill in August of 2013 when it was reported back to the House in 2009, and also the inability of the management this evening, demonstrated by an extraordinary proposal by the Senior Whip on a bill that we all agree with and is now going to take a little longer than perhaps may have been envisaged, but because of a lack of willingness to listen to what other people say, work out what their concerns were, and get the bill progressed. But Mr Chairman, I don't want anyone to be in any doubt of my view and the view I think of every member of this House, that in relation to the Fonterra issue and the need for a robust inquiry, there would be nobody that doesn't say, would not be a single member who doesn't say that the safety of children and other consumers in relation to our exports is paramount, and that's why I certainly support this bill progressing. I heard the member Holly Walker, the Green Party member, express the Green Party's original concerns about the potential for overuse of some of the powers, and I appreciate those concerns and I think they're very valid. I guess our awareness of those sorts of concerns is heightened given that just a little while ago, almost an hour ago, the government rammed through the GCSB bill, which should have, in any ordinary time, with a government that was considerate of the rest of Parliament and indeed of its citizens, would have received much more collaboration and discussion and thought, and have received the, if not unanimous, overwhelming support of the Parliament because of the nature of the process that would have been put together to address any changes. That's often the sort of work that an inquiry would do. An inquiry can step aside from the politics of the situation, examine the circumstances that people have identified as being a problem or an issue that needs examination, and can make independent recommendations to Parliament. I think it's the responsibility of this Parliament to behave more like that on a lot of issues, but particularly in regard to issues of national security. It's exactly the opposite of how the government behaved this afternoon and this evening in relation to the passing of the GCSB bill. So I think the concerns that Holly Walker raised were absolutely correct to be raised, and I'm really pleased that she has found that the amendments as outlined and further consideration has given their party the ability to support this. So how the membership of an inquiry panel is set up, what powers they have, what duties they have, what privileges they have, these are all set out in the changes outlined in Part 1. The ability to call witnesses, to require witnesses to attend an inquiry and for the witnesses to testify on oath is a big change, and certainly had that been the situation with the David Henry inquiry into the leaking of the Kitteridge report, the outcome for Peter Dunn and his ministerial post, perhaps the outcome in terms of other people who have fallen victim, who have been used as scapegoats actually by the government, in my view, in regard to the leaking of the Kitteridge report, the outcomes may have been entirely different. And I do think that when you're talking about people who have very little ability to speak in this House in defence of their position and defend their own personal integrity, or where you have people who might lose their public service positions and who have no ability for a comeback from that in the future, Wellington's a village, we all know what happens in those situations. I think it is the responsibility of anyone in a position of power, and the National Party certainly is in this regard, to maintain an absolute position of integrity and independence from the situation and from the judgment and from the ramifications, and that has not been the position in regard to either David Henry or the other people who have been involved in the subsequent fallout. Mr. Chairman, I was stunned actually to hear tonight, Mr. Chairman.
Ruth Dyson.
Mr. Chairman, I was stunned tonight actually to hear the stories of the National Party members of the Privileges Committee, that's the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, the Honourable Judith Collins and the Honourable Anne Tolley, and the way they turned on David Henry in that Privileges Committee hearing in a way that I'm not sure I recall having occurred before in my time in Parliament. The disrespect, the abuse of a powerful position, and the total undermining of the fact that that man was appointed to do a specific role and did it not just to the best of his ability. I don't know him at all, but he was appointed because of his ability by the Prime Minister, but also did his job within the mandate of the inquiry that he had. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that when we're looking at the way that people run inquiries, we have to recognise that until this bill becomes law, then they are restricted by the mandate, by the terms of reference, by the scope, by the law of the inquiry that they've been tasked with. So I don't think that Mr. Henry has been treated in a way that's appropriate by government members on the Privileges Committee, and I don't think that it has been a fair reflection of the role that he was asked to undertake and that he took within the scope of that inquiry. So because we don't have, as this bill makes obvious, in Part 1 we change all the rules, the scopes for inquiry, but because we currently don't have that ability, the power to call witnesses and to require witnesses to appear on oath, we still don't know who leaked the Kitteridge report, and as a result of the fallout, not only has the Minister lost his position, but we've also had the amazing exposure of information about the fact that the Prime Minister's political chief of staff can get access to members of Parliament and members of the press galleries, phone records and swipe access cards which tell people, other people who are inquiring into something which might be irrelevant, which will tell people which parts of the building we have accessed. Now, many of us might think, in the response to the naive comments that the Prime Minister has made, that if you don't go anywhere that's a bother, then you shouldn't have a concern about it. Well, I reject that, Mr. Chairman. I reject it because my right to privacy and my right to security as a New Zealand citizen should be reinforced by the government, not undermined by it. So we have had not just the example where Wayne Eagleson from the Prime Minister's office is able to put pressure on various parts of our parliamentary system to get access to information about our movements. It's information that we couldn't get through a normal process of inquiry, and I hope those sorts of, in Part 1, in Clause 3, the purpose of the bill is to extend the ability of inquiries to get the sort of information openly and with accountability and transparency that we have seen done with skullduggery and political pressure in the last little while in New Zealand. Mr. Chairman, I just want to finish by going back to the Fonterra inquiry. Our exports are of fundamental importance in terms of our reputation internationally, in terms of our economy, and in terms of how we relate to people and nations around the world. That reputation has had a number of dints in recent times, and one of the driving forces for this bill coming back to the House now is to ensure that the Fonterra inquiry is able, through its enhanced scope and powers, is able to give not just the public and the citizens of New Zealand, but those who buy or who will shop for and hopefully buy our exports off the shelves in many countries. It will give them the confidence that we were as concerned about contamination in New Zealand as they were, and that we got the full truth about the situation and aired that full truth and made sure that what we learnt from that contamination was addressed so that it couldn't happen in the future. So the security of our exports and the safety and security of consumers is of critical importance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sir, I was not going to take